Hey guys, welcome to this week's episode of the Budding Watch Enthusiast. Here in this channel, I discuss and review wristwatches from the perspective of someone who has not been collecting for very long. So if you like what you see here, please consider clicking the red subscribe button down below. So I've been collecting now for nearly 2 years at this point, and I've gotten quite the crash course in wristwatches between watches that I've owned, watches that I've gotten to see at different events, just watching and gathering as much information as possible. There's a lot of tips, a lot of, I guess we can call them pro tips, about wristwatches that I really wish I had known back when I first started collecting that I've kind of picked up and learned over these last couple of years. So today, we're going to be talking about 5 pro tips that are especially geared towards newer watch collectors or maybe watch collectors that don't immerse themselves into wristwatches as much as enthusiasts can tend to. So like I said, I'm hoping you guys pick up some good information from this video. A quick wristwatch check before we get into it. I'm wearing my Hamilton Khaki Field day date automatic, a watch that I've owned for a year and a half now, and a watch that actually relates back onto this pro tip list more than you might imagine, just because of it actually adheres to a lot of different things on the list, and I'll probably reference those as we go through here as well. So pro tip number 1. Water resistance isn't everything. If I'm ever reviewing a watch on the channel, and I feel like if a watch has less than 200 meters water resistant, for example, I always get some comments down below talking about how, a watch is kind of looked down on because it doesn't offer a higher water resistance rating. And this is true of both dive watches and non-dive watches alike. And I think that we get hung up on the number quite a bit with water resistance without necessarily understanding what that number is actually indicative of. Because let's be honest, most of us watching this video, if not all of us, are not professional divers. We're not even frequent amateur divers. And usually if you're going to go diving nowadays, you're not going to be taking a traditional wristwatch down with you on a deep dive. I mean, you still might, but you're also going to have a dive computer that is often going to take the place of, the necessity of that wristwatch. So really, water resistance nowadays is much more of a spec thing. It's a cool bullet point to have on a watch, as opposed to necessarily being a practical spec that the end user really does need to worry about. But what a water resistance rating does mean is it can clue you into some of the ways in which the watch is built. For example, if a watch has a water resistance rating of 300 plus meters, you can expect that it's probably going to have a screw down crown. It's probably going to have pretty good seals inside of that crown as well, so that you really don't have to worry about water seeping into that watch as well, unless you're foolish with it and you submerge it with the crown popped out, for example. This Hamilton that I'm wearing, for example, has a water resistance of 50 meters, so you can already tell from there the crown isn't going to be screwed down. And while I wouldn't worry about getting it wet, I mean, it's a field watch after all, I'm not necessarily going to go swimming with it, but I have plenty of other dive watches that do. On this watch alone, if you go watch my review, you can see a bunch of people talk about how it should be at least 100 meters water resistance, but it really doesn't matter. Like I said, I'm rarely, if ever, going to find myself in 100 meters of water, and I can guarantee you that if I know that I'm going to be, this watch is not going to be the one on my wrist anyway, nor would I need it to be, because like I said, if I'm going to be in that kind of water, I'm going to wear a dive watch. So don't get too hung up on water resistance, and again, just kind of understand what water resistance actually means for your watch. Pro tip number 2 is the gray market, and I think that for any watch collector, it is super important to at least educate yourself as to what the gray market is. Now, I haven't done a full video on the gray market before. I probably will end up doing one at some point, but just a quick synopsis. The gray market is watch dealers that are not authorized watch dealers, but they are selling legitimate watches. They're not stolen watches, they're not counterfeit watches or anything of that nature. They're legitimate places to buy watches from, but you're doing it without the protections that you would get buying from an authorized dealer, which is typically the warranty. That's typically what you're missing out on. Now, of course, the benefit to this is that you can often get watches at much lower pricing than MSRP because gray markets are just looking to make whatever money they can. They're not necessarily looking to make all the money, and plus they have to compete with authorized dealers. Now, why is this important? Well, first of all, if you are a newer watch collector, and let's say that you're looking at something like this Hamilton, for example, and you go onto Hamilton's website and you see that this watch cost around $900 brand new. And you say, okay, then you do a Google search to see who has the watch in stock, and you will come across a plethora of websites that are selling this same watch for around $600. And you might think to yourself, that's an amazing deal. What a steal of a deal that is. I'm going to order from this place. It's important, though, that you understand that that is a gray market seller that you are buying from. No authorized dealer is going to be able to list the price of this watch for less than what Hamilton deems the MSRP to be. And the reason that this is also important is because most gray markets aren't very upfront about the fact that they are gray markets. As a matter of fact, many gray markets will be somewhat deceptive around their marketing. I actually bought this watch from a gray market seller. And again, this was in the infancy of my watch collecting. I bought it from Amazon, not realizing that Amazon is pretty much a gray marketplace for most watches as it is. And the place that I bought it from, the private seller that I bought it from, did sort of advertise themselves as being an authorized dealer. So I thought I was buying it from a trusted source. It turns out that it wasn't. Now, I've been very fortunate. This watch has been pretty much perfect since I got it from that gray market dealer. And that's another thing you have to realize as well. Just because it's gray market doesn't mean that the watch is going to be bad, or doesn't mean that you're going to have problems with the watch. It just means that you're opening yourself up to a bigger risk. So I'm not saying that you shouldn't buy from gray markets or that it's dangerous to buy from gray markets. Far from it. There's some gray markets that are very reputable dealers out there as well. It's just that you have to know what you're getting into going in. Do your homework, check reviews of that particular dealer as well before you save yourself the money. And honestly, for a watch, like, everyone has their limit as far as like the top end of what they would buy a gray market watch from. And I'm going to tell you right now, generally, if a watch costs more than like $1,500, stick to an authorized dealer. You don't want to be left holding the bag in case you buy a watch that takes crap on you and the gray market dealer is not very good to be able to repair it. So again, understand what gray markets are and know who you're buying watches from when you're buying them brand new. The next pro tip for you guys is about watch measurements. Now, typically as enthusiasts, we tend to be kind of focused in around the width of a watch case. And there's very good reason for that as well, because the width of the case is typically what's put forward by most brands as what differentiates many similar watches from one another, or watches that are in the same product line from one another. But the funny thing is that case width is not going to be the best representation for how a watch wears on your wrist. The important measurement that you need to know is actually the lug-to-lug distance, or the length of the watch. It's way more important than the width. So I have an 8-inch wrist. My sweet spot for watches is going to typically between 40 and 42 millimeters in width. But depending on how long or not long a case is going to really affect how a watch fits on my wrist. There's plenty of 40 millimeter watches that are much more stout from lug to lug that don't look well on my wrist because they don't stretch kind of the full length of my wrist as they're sitting on there. Likewise, there are some 44 millimeter width watches that look great on my wrist and are super comfortable to wear because they have that shorter lug to lug distance. And this Hamilton, for example, this is a great example of a watch. This is 42 millimeters in width. 42 millimeters is pretty much a universal size at this point. It's on the top end for people that have smaller wrists, but it's right in the wheelhouse for people with larger wrists. But there are a lot of smaller wristed folks who can't pull off this watch because while it's only 42 millimeters in length, the lugs stretch super far away from the case, and it's over 50 millimeters in lug to lug distance. For most people, the sweet spot on lug to lug is going to be right around 48. And I know that 2 millimeters doesn't sound like a very big difference, but when you're talking how a watch wears on your wrist, it could be the difference between it looking right and looking ridiculous sitting on your wrist. So whenever you're looking at watches, don't just look at the watch width, always look at the lug to lug distance, and always know kind of what your ideal lug to lug distance is going to be, because that's going to inform you how that watch is going to look on your wrist, especially when you're shopping online and you might not get a chance to check out the watch in person. So number 4 that we're going to talk about today is a big one, and it's what that Swiss made means on the bottom of your watch and why it might not be as important as you may initially think. Now, of course, if you're not too into watches, there's the preconception out there that watches made in Switzerland tend to be of a higher quality than watches made anywhere else in the world. And so whenever you see Swiss made on the bottom of a dial, you might automatically think that that means that the watch is of higher quality. But it's important to understand what that term Swiss made actually means when you're talking about a wristwatch. So I have a list right in front of me here. Here's the 4 things that a watch must have in order to be designated as Swiss made. So at least 60% of the manufacturing costs must be generated in Switzerland. It must have a Swiss movement inside of it, which typically means an ETA movement or a Sellita movement or a Swiss made in-house movement. The movement has to be encased in the watch in Switzerland, and the final inspection of the watch has to be made in Switzerland. So what this means in a very broad sense is that watches that are designated as being Swiss made don't necessarily have to be made in Switzerland. As a matter of fact, many parts of the watch, the case, the crystal, the dial, and that might include the movement as well, because only 50% of the movement parts value has to be made in Switzerland. That doesn't even include assembly of the movement. So there's lots of parts that might come from other regions of the world. The other reason that that distinction is not as important to me, or at least not as important as it once was, I think, is because Japanese watchmaking, I don't know if you guys realize, is pretty good right now. If you have a watch that has a Seiko NH variant in it, or you have a Miyota 9015 or anything in that 9000 Miyota series, guess what? You've got a pretty solid watch movement. The finishing might not be too glamorous on it, but it's going to perform really well. And likewise, you also have to realize that just because a movement is Swiss doesn't mean it's going to be the best quality. ETA has 4 different grades of their movements, ranging from less accurate to being like dead-on COSC certified accurate. But most, especially from micro brands and indie brands, if they're getting an ETA movement, it's typically going to be from that lowest grade movement available. And again, this doesn't mean it's going to be bad. It's going to still be a good quality movement, but the performance variance that you get in those can be a lot wider ranging sometimes. So again, understand what Swiss made means when you see it on a watch. And I wouldn't also necessarily pick one watch over another just because it happens to be Swiss made. Again, do the research, understand what about that watch makes it so. The last thing we're going to talk about today is something I think I've touched on in other videos before, but when you see 2 watches, for example, that are in a similar price tier, maybe they might have the same movement, they might be similar styled watches, and you might say, you know, what's the difference really between these 2 watches? It always comes down to finishing. Finishing is one of the most important aspects of any watch to me. And when I'm looking at what a watch costs, and if I see a watch that maybe sits above its peers in pricing for, you know, between 2 similar watches, I'm always going to look at the finishing of that watch to determine a watch's quality. It's kind of, for me, it's kind of the go-to. This is especially true in the micro brand world, or in the independent watch world especially. The reason that companies like NTH, the reason that companies like Notice are generally thought of as being among the best micro brands out there really does boil down to the finishing that's done on their watches. Both of those companies, for example, have excellent finishing on any watch that they put out. And again, some of this is like really nerdy watch stuff. Like, I don't expect every single one of you guys out there to take every watch that comes in like I do and put it under a loop to kind of check out the finishing on the dial, the finishing on the hands, the finishing on the markers, to kind of see how it stacks up against other watches. But case finishing especially, and again, brushed finishing more than anything else, is going to really kind of separate the wheat from the chaff when you're talking about watch brands. So those are 5 pro tips for you guys, things that I've picked up and things that I think are really important to know when you're looking at different watches out there. I would love to hear what you guys think in the comments below. And if you guys have any pro tips that you think I missed and that should definitely be out there, you can let us know in the comments. If you guys like this video, hit the thumb down there below. If you loved it, click the red subscribe button, hit the bell icon, and share it with your friends. Thank you guys very much for watching this video, and I will see you all the next time.